Remember, when you ask for help, it's not just about you. When you ask for help, you're enabling and empowering all those people around you, your teammates, your colleagues, the people that work for you, to do the same.
Someone cares about you.
There's a reason why your heart is beating.
You still have a purpose.
Don't give up.
It's important to know that you're not alone.
You're not alone.
You're not alone.
You are not alone.
This week, we have the honor of welcoming a veteran who has broken barriers, overcome adversity, and is an inspiration for us all. Our guest today is Nicole Malachowski, a retired Air Force colonel, renowned motivational speaker, and an advocate for military veterans. With her captivating story of resilience and determination, Nicole will share how she made history in the world of aviation and overcame life-threatening challenges to continue to make a difference in the lives of people across the globe. Nicole, welcome to the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I love learning about your journey, all the information that you provide online, your background, your website. It's all so incredible. But I'd love for you to take us back to the beginning. Can you share your journey and share what inspired you to join the Air Force in the first place?
Yeah, I grew up in a middle class, California family, married parents, brother and a sister, pretty comfortable, right? Pretty good place to be. I knew growing up, both of my grandfathers had served in the military, in the Navy, and my father had been drafted into the Army during Vietnam. And so from a very, very young age, I was surrounded, if you will, with an environment that honored military service. I knew that wearing your nation's uniform was honorable and noble and good. We were the type of family, right, that would go to the Veterans Day parades or Memorial Day. I knew what that meant as a young kid, learning to respect the flag, that kind of thing. And then when I was in kindergarten, first grade, 5, 6 years old, the local air show came to town. And I remember going out and seeing all the aircraft. And there was a jet flying called the F-4 Phantom, which I'm sure many of the listeners know was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. And when the jet came screaming by, I remember it shook my whole body. And I remember smelling the jet fuel. You could see the gray smoke coming out of the engine back in those days. And I remember covering my ears and shaking with excitement. It was just so loud. It was like a feast for the senses for a little kid. And I saw that jet go by, and this was probably 1979. And I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. When you put together that type of technology and aviation excitement with a background that honored military service from my family, I think the conclusion was, I'm going to grow up and be a fighter pilot someday. And so I can distinctly remember that moment.
Now, there was a lot of kids that in our generation that grew up watching things like Top Gun. I got to experience fighter jets flying across the USS Harry Truman when I was on a Tiger cruise with my brother in the 8th grade. And I remember thinking one day, I want to be Maverick. I want to be in the skies, but it's a rigorous process and there's a lot of competitions. How'd you make that dream a reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly difficult, I think, to become a fighter pilot. There just aren't that many slots available. And the whole process, as you mentioned, is very competitive. Even from that young age, I think I learned to work from the target backwards. That target was the goal of becoming a fighter pilot. So the question then became, and my parents and my family were very good about asking the rhetorical question, like, well, it's great. You want to be a fighter pilot, but how do you do that? And so even in elementary school, I remember researching, well, you have to be commissioned as an officer. What do you need to do that? Well, you need a 4-year degree. That's when I discovered, the Air Force Academy, the Naval Academy. And I actually recall in the 6th grade at the age of 12, writing a letter to the Air Force Academy admissions office, wanting to know everything about how I could get in, how I could, be accepted, how I could get a pilot slot. And they actually wrote back. And I had a candidate admissions book at the age of 12. And I used that literally as my roadmap. I realized that I would need to have good grades. I realized where my SAT and ACT scores needed to be. So started working, towards that. I realized I needed to do, team sports or things, like Civil Air Patrol and Junior ROTC, which I did both, and community service type activities. So honestly, it was just working from the target backwards. I tell people as a child, I was very maniacally focused on becoming a fighter pilot. I'm glad it worked out because I honestly never had a backup plan. So timing was everything. And interestingly, in 1979, when I set my mind on being a fighter pilot, it was against the law for women to be fighter pilots.
Oh,
And that law wouldn't change until I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy in 1992. So little did I know, right, that my dream, my entire childhood was actually illegal.
that's wild to discover that what you had been planning for your entire life may not legally even be available to you when you had kind of discovered that you might face those types of challenges entering into a new career field of women in aviation, especially fighter pilots. Did your mindset have to adjust or change anyway about any upcoming barriers?
I don't think I really saw those barriers or felt them until I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, because I remember the first time I distinctly understood it was against the law. I go back again to sixth grade, age 12, the year Top Gun came out. So I'm really doubling down on this dream, right? And that's when I discovered it's against the law. Well, you don't tell a 12-year-old kid that Congress has a law preventing you from doing something. It doesn't register. It doesn't make sense. And so I think my childhood mind didn't care. I knew that I was going to be able to do this. Like, that's a ridiculous law. And it wasn't until I found myself, at the age of 17, heading off to the Air Force Academy, surrounded by a lot of men and women like me who wanted to become fighter pilots, that those real conversations started happening. And interestingly, it was about that time, 1992, 1993, when I went to the Air Force Academy, that the conversations were happening in Congress to adjust the law. And in fact, we ended up having our first woman fighter pilot, Jeannie Leavitt, in 1993 when I was a sophomore at the Academy. So the law was changing like as I was progressing along this dream. I tell people my life is all about TLC. I don't mean tender loving care. My life and successes have been about timing, luck, and circumstance.
Well, luck, from what I understand, is preparation mixed with the right amount of timing too.
That's what they say. Like I said, I stayed very focused as a kid. I was a bit of a nerd, not going to lie. Just stayed focused on those grades, participating in Civil Air Patrol Junior ROTC. Started taking flying lessons when I was 12. I used to water plants at a plant nursery. And then I would get on my little 10-speed bike, right, and head on down to the airport and hand them my $40. You could get a Cessna 150, 152 all fueled up with an instructor for 40 or 50 bucks back then.
Yeah, that's definitely a price cut from what they're charging now. But I'm super excited that you managed to pursue your dream wholeheartedly and maintain that razor-like focus, because you ended up having an illustrious career as an Air Force pilot.
Well, I got lucky though too, right? Like I said, timing, luck, and circumstance. And I had always been surrounded by people who supported my dream. And I think that was extraordinarily important to this focus that you mentioned. In high school, being in Civil Air Patrol and participating in Air Force Junior ROTC kept me around like-minded people, kept me focused, kept me disciplined, kept me committed. I think sometimes if I wasn't in those organizations, I don't know that this would have turned out the same way.
Yeah, absolutely not. Having the right people supporting you, guiding you along the way, that also were able to kind of not just ask the rhetorical questions, but also provide additional guidance on how to actually achieve that and create those steps. And, from what I understand, the planes that you flew in, from the F-16s and the combat operations, and then finally leading to become an Air Force Thunderbird, soaring the skies with some of the best fighter pilots in the world. Could you share a little bit about that experience and what it was like being a part of that elite team?
I'll tell you what, I mean, being a part of the Air Force Thunderbirds in any capacity is obviously a huge honor. It is a 100% hand-picked team. I loved all of the airmen that I have served with, but there was something special about the Thunderbirds. There's about 125 airmen from 25 different career functions, who come together to make that mission happen. It's not just the 6 pilots, that you see flying in the show. And I'm telling you, the quality, the attention to detail, the sense of urgency, the pride, the precision of all of these, especially our enlisted airmen, was absolutely mind-blowing. To this day, it just, when I reminisce about them and what they were able to accomplish, it just, I don't know, it makes my heart really, really happy. For all of us, the honor certainly of a career and of a lifetime. I like to remind people too, our job was to go out there and represent the United States Air Force, with the honor and the integrity and the dignity that that it deserved. And so it was also a huge responsibility. And it was a responsibility that all of us took very, very seriously. I mean, we were accountable to living up to what people thought a Thunderbird was, right? I mean, there's an aura that kind of comes with it, and there's an expectation, rightfully so, not just by our fellow Air Force airmen and civilians, but of course from, the American public. And so the responsibility to live up to that, to be accountable to that standard of excellence, was something we all took very seriously.
Now, obviously, living up to such high standards can be incredibly stressful, and we can experience, if you'll play for the pun, some turbulence in our lives. Was there ever any moments that kind of stand out to you that being a Thunderbird really aided in helping you get through some difficult parts of your life?
Yeah, absolutely. During training season, which is about 3 months long, we fly twice a day. It's pretty intense. I was probably like halfway through training season when we were learning a new maneuver that I literally could not figure out. It's called the trail to diamond roll. Actually, the Thunderbirds don't fly it anymore. So this is a bit of a throwback conversation here. But no matter how many times we practiced it, I couldn't figure it out. And it hurt because I was at the height of my career, supposedly the height of my skill sets. I was considered an experienced fighter pilot. I'm with these 5 amazing, pilots that were also selected for the team. They all had it figured out, and I couldn't figure it out. So we couldn't move on with the training syllabus. And I remember like how bad I felt. And, my ego was taking a huge hit. And also, let's not forget, I could read the headlines now, first woman Thunderbird pilot fails out of training. So there was that pressure that was also, on me at the time. And I remember one day in debrief, taking a deep breath, exhaling, and saying the 3 hardest words of my career, which were, I need help. And I distinctly remember that being a red flag for everyone, because in a good way, right? Because as fighter pilots, we kind of have that macho mask. We don't need help. We're self-sustaining. We'll get through it. I'll just grit it out and figure it out on my own. And in what we were doing, that just wasn't the right answer. And so when I said I need help, it was freeing for me. But it was also, I think, the right thing, the right signal that my team needed to hear, like, hey, she's not going to mentally get past this. Let's put in the work. And what happened was the team stopped. And for like 2 days straight, we did that maneuver hundreds of times until I figured it out. And they helped me not from a place of judgment or shame, but from a place of caring and compassion as a teammate, and from a place of shared commitment. And I distinctly remember asking for help, like outwardly for the first time. And it would serve me well for the remainder of my career when I needed help, say, as a fighter squadron commander, or when I needed help when I was working at the White House. And most importantly, when I needed help dealing with my very life-changing medical issues that would come out of nowhere. So I learned the power of asking for help.
Wow. First of all, to be the first person to do anything, whether it's the first minority to be a part of a sports team, the first person to step onto a battlefield, the first woman to step on a Thunderbirds training squadron, that carries a lot of weight with it.
Yeah, it does.
How did you handle that pressure? Because like you said, being a fighter pilot, you don't ask for help. And especially you're a new breed of fighter pilots. You're amongst the first women that had to become Air Force fighter pilots. And now you're now breaking into a new pioneering space for women. I can just imagine the women that are looking up to you, that are coming up 8 years old at these air shows, knowing your story. How do you handle that type of pressure in the moment?
Yeah, at the time, I will admit there was a lot of pressure. I will tell you the pressure and the interest really came from outside the Air Force, or shall I say very senior level people in the Air Force who were still, I think, culturally adapting to women being fighter pilots, let alone being selected to be a Thunderbird. But on the team itself, there wasn't a lot of pressure because remember, the gentlemen that I flew with were my age. They had never known an Air Force without women fighter pilots in it. So to us, this was really the natural progression of things. But the microscope from the outside, right, globally from around the world, which was predominantly very supportive. People were generally tickled that there was a woman Thunderbird pilot. But of course, I'm not going to tell you it was all unicorns and rainbows. I got thousands of letters of non-support. Some of them were very cruel and vitriolic. So when you are the first at something, oftentimes you can be a very distinct challenge to the balance, of other people. But I tried during that time to focus on flying the jet as best as I could, right? Being the best Thunderbird writ large, that I could be on that team of 125 people, and representing the Air Force, right? At the end of the day, just fly the jet. Most of the pressure on being a first, looking back now as an almost 50-year-old woman, I will say I put on myself. I wanted to open the door. I wanted to be a Thunderbird and finish my Thunderbird tour in a way that I opened the door for other women and in a way that the door stayed open. I was distinctly aware that if I had messed up, I would probably mess it up for a while, at least a few years for any women that had come, behind me. And I'll tell you, I hated nothing more at that time than being called the first woman Thunderbird pilot. Oh, it just got underneath my skin. Every headline, first woman Thunderbird pilot. I wanted to be known as a great Thunderbird. I wanted to be known as a great fighter pilot. And then I had an aha moment. I went to my first air show. And of course, when we land, we go over to the autograph line to talk to the audience. And of course, I had tons of camera in my face, right? CNN, MSNBC, they were all there because this was the first woman Thunderbird's first air show, first interaction with the audience. And as I was signing autographs, I looked over at the other 5 pilots down the line, and they had 15, 20 people lined up in front of each of them. And then I took a moment and I looked in front of me, and there were well over 100 people in line. And what do you think that demographic was? It was all young women, right? Between the age of 8 and 16, as you might expect. And it was in that moment I realized it means something to see someone who looks like you succeeding. And in that moment, I realized that you can walk a very fine line if you do it with awareness and authenticity in being called the first woman Thunderbird pilot, because those young girls, they don't remember my name. It's not about me. What it was what I represented to them and what I represented within them and their own dreams. And so I kind of had that maturing moment where I go, okay, somebody had to be the first woman Thunderbird pilot. I'll do my best to live up to that.
That's beautiful that you were able to experience that as a young pilot too, a young woman, just learning how to develop some of these characteristic traits. I mean, it wasn't long before that you actually learned how to ask for help, which is a critical skill for anybody to have in life, whether it's starting a new job, raising your children, trying to find resources to overcome a challenge that you're experiencing.
Right. Asking for help is it's a skill set, and it's one that needs to be practiced and consistently, nurtured. Sometimes society says if you ask for help that you're showing that you're weak, or that you're not all in, or that you're not fully committed, or, you're not up to the standards of everybody else. And I think you and I definitely know that the opposite of that is true. And when I became a fighter squadron commander, I remember talking to the guys about this. I need us to ask for help. We were overworked, under-resourced, undermanned. It was sequestration. All that was going on. I said, if you need help, you got to stop and you ask for help. And again, it goes a little bit against that fighter pilot mask, right, that we all wear. And the way that I got them kind of to understand or to buy into this asking for help or being vulnerable is really what we're talking about, is I told them, remember, when you ask for help, it's not just about you, right? When you ask for help, you're enabling and empowering all those people around you, your teammates, your colleagues, the people that work for you, to do the same. So if you can't do it just purely for yourself, do it for other people. And that was a way to kind of shift the mindset on the power of asking for help.
Exactly. And the more that you learn how to ask for help, the more you learn how to direct that ask to the things that you need. Not just, hey, I'm having a hard time overcoming this, come help me, and getting some extra assistance, but actually starting to recognize and evaluate either your skill sets, your mindset, or the resources that you actually need to be able to move forward through to find an adequate solution to a problem.
Absolutely agree.
With your career of being a combat fighter pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan, a Thunderbird.
I can't claim Afghanistan.
Afghanistan? Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I read that.
Okay. My husband did Afghanistan and not Iraq. So, the family has it covered.
I love that. Being a veteran of both wars, I forget that some people only went to one theater.
Well, I'll date myself, Danny. My first combat was Kosovo.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
That's not much longer before Iraq.
right. I say Kosovo to young kids today, like, my children are their junior high classmates and they just stare at me. I'm like, oh man, we need to talk about history.
Oh, it's so funny, especially within the military community. We're dealing with kids dealing with kids. A 30-year-old person has way more experience than the 18-year-old person coming out of boot camp, and so I can understand where people would get lost in that math. But as a fighter pilot with combat tours in Iraq, a Thunderbird pilot, and then a White House employee, how what do you think was the most stressful duty station for you?
Stressful. I guess it depends, on how you define stress, because I think, we've talked about the Thunderbird stress of living up to the Thunderbird reputation, right? Anybody on the team being responsible and accountable to that, can be high pressure. Certainly being the first woman. When you think about combat, I never really felt stress flying the F-15E in combat, because the truth is I never flew a combat mission that was harder than my training mission. I felt like our F-15E community was thoroughly prepared for what we were called to do. I did feel stressed sometimes as a fighter squadron commander, because we were undermanned, under-resourced, and told to still put out the same, amount of training and sorties. And so trying to take limited resources, match that to the mission set that you've been given, that can be a very gnarly and complex problem, because you're trying to maintain morale, through all of that. But I'll tell you, I've worked at the White House twice, and you want to talk about individual acute moments of stress, I'm going to go with that, which might surprise people. So I had the privilege of serving at the White House twice while I was in the military. The first time I was a White House fellow, 6 months under George Bush and then 6 months under Barack Obama. My job was to serve at the office of the president-elect. So, after a president is elected before inauguration, there's a few months there. They need a place to work and they need someone to run that. So I was on the team that helped run that. Talk about a high stakes, high visibility game. Knowing who the cabinet secretary nominees were going to be before they were ever announced to the public. Washing hands in the bathroom next to people who you've only seen on television. Having them ask you for something and your answer being yes, having no idea how you're going to fulfill that, but you're going to figure it out real quick. So I think some of that military training helped in the White House. And then the second time, I think was a bit of a different type of stress. I was a full bird colonel at the time. I served as the executive director of the Joining Forces program, which was it's back, a White House national initiative to support service members, veterans, and families in all aspects, from veterans homelessness to mental health aspects to military children in school to military spouse employment, you name it, it covered it. And I worked directly for then First Lady Michelle Obama and Dr. Joe Biden. To know that the First Lady can come to you and ask, you're her military, right, like aide, have her look you right in the face and go, I have a military question on any of those topics, and I need to provide an answer to the press in about 30 minutes. And you have to get it right, because it is going to be on the, above the fold on the newspapers or whatever. That could be very, very stressful. And I think representing the military in the White House for all of those issues, I wanted to do right by my community. And we were literally organizing like 60,000 veteran service organizations and military service organizations and trying to align all of that. That was a high stakes game. And I think I took it much more seriously because it was my own tribe. And because it was my own tribe, I think that I carried a little bit of extra stress, which I think rightfully so, right?
Absolutely. When you're working with something that you care about so deeply at such a high level, the stress is naturally there, but the stress is also worth it. Like, some people view stress as a bad thing. For me, a lot of the times I view it as a motivating factor, right? It gives us a reason to take the covers off in the morning and step into our uniform for the day and get to work.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I tell people, when you feel stress, it's probably because you're on the precipice of doing something pretty darn cool, making a really big positive impact. And if you set your mindset in that way, I think it becomes easier to, navigate stress.
Now, working in the White House with all those veteran organizations, homelessness, dealing with some of those issues, Was there anything that really stood out to you that you felt like we were on the precipice of achieving something great for our veterans?
Oh gosh, so many things. I could probably do an entire an entire podcast on just that. You know what I learned is outside of this bureaucracy, outside of, the processes and the regulations and all of that, there are really good Americans working in the VA, really good Americans working in the Department of Defense. I think my cynicism actually went away. A lot of people thought, well, when you're exposed to, how the sausage is actually made, maybe you're going to become more cynical. I think I was exposed to the beauty and of the American public, their support for the service members, veterans, and military families. I remember being in a room with dozens of mayors who were making commitments to lower veterans homelessness in their own cities and signing up to collaborate on that. I mean, that's a huge deal. I remember being there with governors making cross-state compacts so that military spouses could carry their certifications and licensing across, state borders. Like, that is impactful stuff. I remember the Military Children's Education Compact. How do we help our young people as they move around the world, from school to school to make sure that they're getting the education that they deserved? And you can see how excited I am. So, wow. I mean, I don't know that I've ever been in a position or a place where I touched and was a part of big things that made a big difference in the lives of service members, veterans, and especially our military families.
I'm so glad that you got that experience. I had an opportunity to work for the VA as well, and all of my cynicism has fallen away. I usually don't carry much cynicism with me, to be honest with you. But one of the things that we discover is if we have a resentment or an anger against something, and we do a thorough enough investigation, meaning that we actually talk to the people that work there, we discover where their pain points are. That contentment that we start to have does start to fade away, and we start to become an advocate for that. And I'm really glad that happened for you as you were working with these veteran organizations, getting a chance to see, because unbeknownst to you at the time, you were about to experience a life-changing.
Little did I know.
Would you mind sharing about that? Because your career ended up taking an abrupt turn, and anybody with the wrong mindset could have taken down a wrong road.
Absolutely. So there I am, working as a full bird colonel for the First Lady. My office is in the East Wing of the White House. Things are going really well. I'm working with wounded warriors, all of this. And little did I know I was about to become one. While I was at that assignment, I had been falling ill for about 3 years. The doctors couldn't really figure it out. But as a military person, especially a pilot, right, you avoid the doctors. You're trying to just gut through, and you figured it's all going to get better. But unfortunately, while I was working at the White House, I fell severely ill. In fact, in July of 2016, I woke up in bed and I was basically, I had moments of temporary locked-in syndrome. So you've heard of locked in, so you can't walk, talk, read, write, or move. And these moments of paralysis would just come and go at random times and last for a few seconds. And it was very, very strange. But I found myself, again, unable to walk safely, unable to speak coherently. I had a lot of massive confusion, excessive fatigue, joint and muscle pain. To the Air Force's credit, since they'd been looking at me for a few years, they said, we don't know what's wrong. They sent me up to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was able to go to Massachusetts General Hospital, who cast the net wide without getting into tons of boring details, which I'm happy to share anytime. I was diagnosed and began treatment there. My career, that amazing career we've talked about, the one I loved so much, was gone in the blink of a bite. I am the survivor of late-stage neurological tick-borne illness. Lyme disease plus 4 other pathogens had impacted my brainstem, hence the moments of temporary paralysis. I remember being in a wheelchair. I couldn't talk, so my husband was talking for me to the doctors. He said, that's great. She has a diagnosis. Give her the shot in the butt or the pill, and she'll be back in the jet, which is what I wanted. And I'll never forget sitting there, and the doctor said, it's going to be at least 2 years of treatment, and she'll never be 100% again. And it was at that moment that I realized my life was going to change, forever. So for the next 9 months, I was bedridden at home. I had a PICC line or an IV to my heart and a home healthcare nurse. And then I spent another year and a half in rehab, part of it down at Fort Belvoir, learning to walk, talk, read, and write again. And during that time, I was understandably medically retired from the career that I love. So, I went from this really elite, supposedly high performing officer and fighter pilot to completely broken overnight, dependent on people for all of my activities of daily living. And sitting there thinking, like, who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? What's my contribution to society if I'm not a pilot or an officer? How am I going to provide for my family? And so there was a lot of like identity, crisis and sadness and depression. Of course, at that time, it was a very difficult time, not just for me, but of course for my family. So found myself medically retired on 29 December 2017. I was still homebound at that time. There was no ceremony. I had some of my retirement certificates and stuff mailed to my house. And I'll never forget what a lonely day that was because nobody from the Air Force called. That was it. I was done. And so then I had to think, what am I going to do, to move forward? How am I going to move forward? So big questions at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounded like your whole Air Force career was leading towards, at least 2 stars on your uniform at one
That's
point.
generous.
Easy. But to have that dream of being a pilot, and I know for the most part, whenever there's anything that medically grounds you can no longer get behind any plane anymore, commercial or military wise. So how did you navigate such difficult period of time going through medical treatment, losing your career, not having a proper send-off, which happens with most of our medically retired and separated service members?
I do what any laser-focused fighter pilot would do, which is do what I can to change the process and make it better for somebody else. And so in the last week heading out the door, I was over in the patient squadron assigned at Andrews Air Force Base. The Wounded Air Force Wounded Warrior Program was having their big Andrews Air Force Base, care event. It's going to be hundreds of people there. And the guest speaker was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Goldfein. And they said, well, Nicole, since you're heading out the door and you can talk again, and you're the colonel and, you're our Air Force Thunderbird, would you mind being the wounded warrior who speaks? And I said, oh, indeed, I would love that. And I took the stage in front of General Goldfein and I told the truth. And I talked about how difficult it is for wounded warriors to transition, where the lack of help and support was, where the process and procedure led caring for people, right? The exact opposite as it should be, where the regulations were wrong, because I did what any colonel would do, right? I assessed that. And I said it right in front of him. You should have seen his face and also the faces of everyone in the audience who were cheering me on. They're like, woo, woo. And he came up to me afterwards and he pulled me aside. He goes, well, we definitely need to talk. And I said, yes, sir. And at about 2 or 3 in the morning that night, I was thinking, did I do the right thing? Right. I took my last shot across the bow, because the way that people transitioning for wounded, ill, or injured is not okay. It's not the way we're supposed to be treating. And it's not the promise we make to each other. I got a text from him that says, I can't sleep. Let's talk tomorrow. And so the first week that I was out of the military, I was in a business suit in the Pentagon presenting my ideas, which resulted in a Tiger team, which resulted in regulation and instruction changes. And I still serve today as a mentor and ambassador with the Air Force Wounded Warrior Program. So I guess I focused it on changing it for the better when there's still a long way to go. Don't get me started, but making it better for other airmen.
And there's always going to be a long way to go to improve things. But as long as we're continuously being honest and not vengeful, speaking up to people in power in a respectful manner to say we need to do something, we need to do better. And these are the things that we can. We bring you. It sounds like you do what I always suggest to people: bring the solution along with the problem. If you're just bringing a problem, you're just bringing another problem.
General Goldfein, I got to tell you, A+, man, that guy is a leader's leader. The way he listened, the way he was compassionate, the way he cared was totally genuine and authentic. And when I brought solutions, he's like, well, I know you don't work for the Air Force anymore, but would you mind helping me on this? And so, we did. I just want to give kudos right now to General Goldfein.
Big kudos to the general for hearing you and taking your concerns seriously, and then also offering you an opportunity to continue to make a difference in the lives of your fellow service members and veterans. Could you talk about the work that you're doing today because this isn't your only position. You're also serving on a board for tick-borne illnesses. You're providing public speaking, inspirational speeches to businesses and companies across the states, and still can continue to make worldwide changes.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm certainly trying. I go back to that day I was on the couch of my retirement thinking, I am someone who sits in front of you today, Danny, with major autonomic nervous dysfunction. I can't control my temperature, heart rate, blood pressure. I have a balance deficit. So in a cruel twist of fate, I get motion sick in airplanes and in cars. I have executive cognitive dysfunction. So my reading, writing, organization, decision-making skills are just shot. My reading, writing's at the 3rd to 6th grade level now. So I sat there. I say that not for poor me, but as context, I sat there thinking, who's going to hire me? What am I going to do? Right? I can't do this. I can't do that. And then I remember distinctly these words came to my head as I sat there: yield to overcome. I don't know why or where those words came from, but yield to overcome to me meant accept what has happened and be forward looking. I didn't ask to get bit by a tick, be misdiagnosed, to get that sick, to lose my job. Right? But what is it that I can do right now with what I have? And I feel like I used to think my legacy was going to be I was an officer in the Air Force and a fighter pilot. But now I believe I was a fighter pilot to learn all the skills and traits I needed to survive my illness, advocate for myself and others, and reinvent myself, right? Focus, determination, resilience, commitment, that kind of fighter pilot grit, all of that allows me to do what I do today. So I do professional motivational speaking. I also do leadership consulting, mostly for Fortune 500 companies. And I honestly think, as strange as this sounds, I make a bigger impact on a grander scale for more people more quickly than if I had ever stayed in the military. So indeed, I am exactly where I am supposed to be, if that makes sense. And so I take the lessons learned from the challenges that I went through personally, from the challenges I saw with the cultural change across, the military during my time. And I translate those, to civilians and to corporate America in hopes that somebody in the audience, because I don't think I'm going to always capture everyone in an audience, but somebody in the audience looks at their own challenges and opportunities through maybe just a slightly different lens. Right? That I go up there and say, hey, if I could overcome this, you can too. If I can go after a gnarly big dream and attain it, you can too. And it's extraordinarily empowering, and it's very invigorating. And believe it or not, I do make an impact on people, which blows my mind, because I always thought it was going to be under military service. But here I am reinvented into something else. And you can still serve other people, right? You can still serve a community. You can still have a positive impact. It doesn't have to be just because you're wearing your nation's uniform, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I'll say, I look forward to the day when I can sit in an audience and listen to you, or even just have a conversation face to face in person, because the energy that you bring, the stories that you bring, just perusing through your Instagram and your Twitter, you provide inspiration on a daily basis. And I see that it means so much to your audience. And I'll be honest, I love your blog.
Well, thank you.
I think I could
I'm glad at least one person reads it.
I could not stop reading it. It is, one, so digestible, and two, it's like having a daily reflections, honestly, to go back and just be like, yeah, that's good about goal setting. Yes, that's good about recognizing limitations and pushing past adversity. The lessons that you teach are so amazing. And so if you could give somebody advice right now that's considering joining the military and chasing a big dream, or leaving the military and needing to make a difficult transition for themselves and their family, what would that advice be to them?
And I think you gave me three very distinct, right, backgrounds. But I think the one thread that might connect them is this: only you get to define success for yourself. Wherever you are in life and whatever is going on in the environment around you, only you define success for yourself. Do not ever let any other human being, organization, corporation, team, whatever, define what success looks like for you. And your definition of success can and should change over time. That's what I'd say.
I love that, defining success for yourself. This podcast brought us together, and we serve a specific purpose, and that's to help our communities prevent veteran suicide right there at home.
Yes.
And I know that you and I both share similar stories of loss, whether it's our career and we've managed to overcome, but we're still losing friends. We're still losing those that we either served with, were close with, or that were a part of our team in our peripheral in some way.
Right. As you and I discussed before we started recording, I woke up this morning to the sad and tragic news of a friend I flew in combat with, taking his own life. 2 weeks ago, I had another friend that I had flown with had taken their own life. So this hits home very real for me. And I think there's two things I would say, and I'm still trying to just digest the news of this morning. If you are feeling alone, right, and you are feeling thoughts of, harming yourself or taking your own life, I would just ask that, you take a deep breath, you realize, that you're not alone. And we talked earlier, Danny and I, about the power of asking for help, right? People want to be helpful. Think about it. When you are asked for help of any kind from other people, don't you usually drop everything you're doing to be of service? There are people out there who want to help you, either in the military community, all the different veteran service programs. I don't know, just walk down the street and introduce yourself to another human being, right? Realize that you're not alone. And I think that we do have a duty to have the courage to ask for help and to actively seek it out. And for the rest of us, right, if someone falls off the radar screen, someone goes calm out for a while, you haven't heard from them, it's time to reach out actively. Do a quick morale check, right? Check in, say, can I bring you a coffee? Can we get on a Zoom? Let's look at each other face to face. I found when I spent 2 years bedridden and housebound that the amount of people who contacted me dwindled to eventually nothing, right? And that is very painful, especially if the person is dealing with their own medical issues or mental health issues. So take the time to actively reach out and do it on a consistent basis. So ask for and offer help.
Thank you. You took the words right out of my mouth and shared it with our audience. This is a serious issue, and take those words to heart. If you are that person that has these thoughts, build your team, find your mentors, find the people in your community that you are comfortable talking with because they want to help you. People that are in your peripheral want to help you. And for those of us looking to make a difference in somebody else's life, do like Nicole here has done, share your journey and bring solutions. Continue to look forward instead of back about the things that you lost, and continue to make those plans and set those goals. Nicole, thank you so much for being a part of the 1 Mile, One Veteran podcast. It's been a pleasure having you here.
It's been my honor. Thank you so much for the opportunity.